All right, let's jump straight into this explainer. And we're going to start with one of the most explosive, just completely unforgettable moments in English football television history. If you followed the Premier League back in the 1990s, you probably already know exactly what I'm talking about. But hey, even if you didn't, the sheer raw emotion of this moment absolutely transcends the sport. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating question. Why did Sir Alex Ferguson, the legendary manager of Manchester United, rely so heavily on psychological warfare? Was it all just a show for the cameras, or was it actually the hidden engine behind his incredible success? Let's get into it. I will love it if we beat them. Love it. Man, you can literally feel the anger radiating off those words, right? That is Kevin Keegan, the manager of Newcastle United, just letting it rip live on Sky Sports back in April 1996. He was visibly shaken up, his finger jabbing relentlessly right at the camera. And the target of all that fury? Sir Alex Ferguson. This infamous I will love it meltdown is basically the ultimate proof that Ferguson's psychological warfare, his so-called dark arts, actually worked. Keegan had taken the bait hook, line, and sinker. So that begs the central question of our explainer today. Why did Sir Alex Ferguson rely on these mind games in the first place? You know, it's really easy to look back now and think it was just petty trash talk or just two stubborn guys trading insults in the press. But as we dig into the history and the psychology behind it, you start to see that this was a highly calculated, tactical weapon. Ferguson didn't just do this to annoy people. He used these maneuvers to completely dominate the Premier League. Section 1. The Art of Mind Games. Weaponizing the Press Conference. You see, when the Premier League was established in 1992, media coverage absolutely exploded. Almost overnight, manager press conferences weren't just boring routine briefings anymore. They turned into absolute battlegrounds. In the high-pressure cooker of English football, mind games really became defined as specific psychological tactics deployed through the media. Ferguson realized something absolutely crucial. Tactical prep and physical fitness, they simply weren't enough on their own. He figured out that if he could lay psychological traps that caused his rivals to emotionally crumble, or if he could forge this intense siege mentality within his own dressing room, he'd gain a massive advantage before a ball was even kicked. Moving to Section 2, Breaking the Entertainers, the 1995/96 title race collapse. We can actually track the exact anatomy of a psychological collapse by looking at Kevin Keegan's incredibly talented, attack-minded Newcastle United squad. Neutrals absolutely loved them. They even dubbed them the Entertainers. But they were about to walk right into a psychological minefield. 12. Just let that staggering number sink in for a second. By January of 1996, Newcastle United held a massive 12-point lead over Manchester United. I mean, think about how comfortable that must have felt. But the English League Championship is just relentless. As physical fatigue started setting in, that gap began to close. And Ferguson? He saw an opening, and not just on the pitch, but right inside Keegan's mind. Watch how surgically this trap was sprung. Mid-April, Ferguson goes public and claims that Leeds players cheated their manager by trying harder against Manchester United than they do against other teams. He specifically wonders aloud if they're going to put in that same effort against Newcastle. Then a couple of weeks later, after Newcastle grinds out a tough 1-0 win against Leeds, Keegan delivers that emotional rant live on TV. He tries to use the post-match interview to claim the moral high ground, but really he just exposes how completely distracted he is. Finally, in May, a rattled Newcastle drops vital points in a 1-1 draw against Nottingham Forest, and Manchester United sweeps in to steal the title. So why did this specific trap work so brilliantly? Well, Ferguson didn't just insult Newcastle's tactics. He craftily suggested that teams wouldn't try as hard against them. And as Keegan himself admitted later on, that hit on something way deeper. It was essentially saying that football wasn't straight. By questioning the sporting integrity of the entire league, Ferguson totally shifted Keegan's focus away from tactical structure and forced him into emotional defense. It provoked that televised meltdown, and ultimately, it resulted in Newcastle dropping those crucial points in the final stretch. But here's the thing. Ferguson didn't just use mind games to break his opponents. He also used them to build his own players up. That brings us to Section 3, Fueling the Persecution Complex, the Arsenal rivalry and dueling psychologies. When Arsene Wenger arrived at Arsenal, Ferguson welcomed him to the reality of the Premier League with barbs like this one from 1997. He's at a big club. Well, Arsenal used to be a big club. Classic Ferguson, right?
It was a deliberate taunt, setting the stage for an elite rivalry that was just dripping with enmity, red cards, tunnel bust-ups, and underneath it all, a massive amount of unspoken respect. These two managers were fundamentally different, and their psychological approaches couldn't have been further apart.
This really perfectly illustrates the analysis of sports psychologist John Kramer. Kramer pointed out that Ferguson intentionally manufactured friction. He was a master of the persecution complex, essentially making his players feel like the whole world was against them just to keep them constantly hungry. Wenger, on the flip side, actively diffused psychological tension. He preferred to tell his players they were superb, creating this environment where they could just relax and show off their skills without the heavy burden of conflict. This dueling psychology birthed what was famously dubbed the irresistible force versus the immovable object. We are talking about brutally hard, epic clashes involving incredibly tough men like Roy Keane and Patrick Vieira. The tension was just palpable. It eventually culminated in historic battles like the 1999 FA Cup semifinal, the one with the pitch invasion and that iconic Ryan Giggs solo winner. The psychological warfare elevated the stakes of absolutely every single tackle and every single pass. All right, on to Section 4, the psychological masterstroke, surviving the attritional grind. Because let's be real, the English League Championship is exactly this, a grueling attritional grind. Over a long 38-game season, the top teams achieve incredible physical and tactical parity. When everyone is fit and everyone knows their tactics inside out, the margin for error shrinks down to a single kick or just a momentary defensive lapse. So the title is ultimately decided by mental endurance. Who blinks first? Who can actually handle the pressure when the calendar finally turns to May? Just think about these numbers. The margins are absolutely microscopic. In that 95-96 season, despite being 12 points down at one stage, United won the title by just 4 points. And in the 1998-99 treble-winning season, they beat Arsenal to the Premier League title by a single point, 79 points to 78. These razor-thin margins prove that a single psychological edge, whether it's a rival manager losing his cool on live TV or your own team feeling this massive us-against-the-world surge of energy, can literally dictate history. So what is the core takeaway of this explainer? Sir Alex Ferguson's mind games were never, ever just press conference theater. They were a highly calculated masterstroke in behavioral engineering. He weaponized the media to create tiny margins of error for his opponents, completely destroying the focus of rival managers like Kevin Keegan. And at the exact same time, he used those very same narratives to forge an unbreakable, unified siege mentality within his own squad. Which leaves us with this final, pretty provocative thought. In today's era of highly sanitized, data-driven football, where every single movement is tracked by analytics and algorithms, have we forgotten that championships are still won and lost in the minds of the managers? Can expected goals and tactical spreadsheets ever truly replace the raw, disruptive power of psychological warfare? It's definitely something to think about the next time you watch a manager step up to the microphone. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep your mind in the game.